Hi. In this video, I'm going to share with you some tips when it comes to answering Capital One's top 7 interview questions. Question number 1, tell me about yourself. Okay, so here I'd like to share 2 tips with you. First is to follow your interviewer's lead. So what happens is, during the job interviews, in the beginning of this conversation, your interviewer will present some details about your future team, more details about the role you're applying for, and some of them might even introduce themselves, present their elevator pitch to you. And I found it's an excellent idea for you to follow their lead when it comes to the length and depth of their answers. Okay, so if they introduce themselves within 15 seconds, it makes little sense for you to have your elevator pitch during a period of, 15 minutes, right? So try to keep it to the point. The only exception to this rule would be when you score well on clarity of thought. So if clarity of thought is a strength you have, then chances are you'd want to bias towards longer answers because they would be to your advantage. You would interview on your strength, so to speak. The second piece of advice I'd like to briefly mention here is to pay particular attention when you sell yourself in your elevator pitch, because there's a bad habit in interviews today. There's actually 2 bad habits, but the first one is that people oversell themselves. In other words, you speak about stuff you didn't actually own entirely for the purpose of that conversation. And what happens is that your elevator pitch could easily be the starting point of a broader deep dive in job interviews. And I've seen a good number of occasions where exceptional candidates would oversell themselves on some of their experiences, such as, I led a $200 million bid to build some AI application, when in fact the guy was only a PM, a technical PM in the process. He might have been part of the team, but he was by no means the one leading the whole thing, right? And then, the conversation would evolve, okay, but how did you do that? The interviewer became interested when it comes to more details about that specific experience, and things did not turn out well for that candidate. So when you sell yourself in a job interview, try to limit the amount of bluffing, especially towards the final interview rounds, because that's when it matters the most. That's when the probability they'd be interested in a deep dive significantly increases. And I said there are 2 trends in interviews today. The one with overselling yourself, and the other one with AI. So AI rewarded answers don't work in job interviews. Okay, I'm just putting it out there. The second question I'd like to talk about here would be a time when you had a conflict with someone on your team. Could be a manager, could be a peer, could be cross-functionally and whatnot. Okay, so questions around conflict are very common in job interviews and any behavioral interviews for that matter. So what would be some tips when it comes to answering such questions? Well, first of all, it's a behavioral question. Tell me about the time when you had a conflict with someone, and you would want to seriously consider answering in the STAR format. Okay, so STAR format is beneficial to most candidates because it structures your answers and it facilitates your communication with your interviewer, and your interviewer will probably also appreciate your STAR answers because people prefer familiar approaches. They would even expect at times you use the STAR answers. Now, with respect to how to answer questions around conflict, a framework, if you want, a very simple one, would be there are 2 types of conflicts. There's the functional conflict and the non-functional one. The functional one refers to your subject matter expertise. So if you're an accountant, you had, difference of opinion with, maybe with the director over some functional stuff. How would you resolve that conflict? Well, you listen to the other part, to the director's point of view, then you came up with your reasoning, your analytical thinking, if you want, with the goal to establish trust. Okay, so you resolve conflicts by establishing trust. This is key to understand what resolving and answering questions around conflict. So this was the functional conflict, and there's the non-functional conflicts. Tell me about the time when someone did not like you. How do you deal with people who don't like you? And unless you're applying for a people manager level role, I would encourage you to divest from the non-functional, even if the question is asking for non-functional conflict, to speak about the functional one. So even if I'd ask you, tell me about time when someone did not like you, I still take that director with whom I had some beef over some report, and I prove my point. I would listen to their side of the story with the goal to establish trust. Okay, so this would be, in very simple terms, again, a behavioral interview question. Question number 3, tell me about your most challenging project or initiative or decision, depending on the type of work you do. Okay, so if there's one thing you'd want them to remember about you, what would that be? Okay, so I found this super beneficial to prepare in advance of the job interviews, because you'll be surprised the number of people who would choose their second or third best story during the heat of the moment. And chances are you might want to share different stories with different stakeholders in the hiring process. Maybe you'd want to choose a story that's not as technical with a recruiter when compared to someone who's, right before the job offer. Okay, so the most challenging project was the best story that you prepared for the job interview. And as the previous question, this is also a behavioral interview question, which means, the answers should be structured most of the time in the STAR format. Okay, so present the situation with the challenge, then the action, then some quantifiable results, ideally. Okay, question number 4. Tell me about a time when a product, service, or solution was already receiving good customer feedback, but you decided to do more. Okay, so this is again a behavioral interview question. Tell me about a time when. However, this is a trick question. The reason why this would be a trick question is that the interviewer is looking to understand what do you call high standards in your work. So, for example, the vast majority of candidates, let's say IT roles here. Let's take an example for an IT role. A product or service is already receiving good customer feedback. So you would talk about a piece of software which was working fine, but it still had some bugs. Okay, so you decided to fix those bugs for the customer, and the customer was happy. Customer could be an internal customer, of course. So this would showcase that your standards of quality would be pretty low, because the product or service, even though it was working, it was a bit flimsy, So your standards in your work would be pretty low. Now, if on the other hand, I would give an example, something online, so the product or service was working beautifully and the customer was happy, and you delighted your customer by looking around the corner and providing them with some extra reports, which they didn't even know they needed, okay, that would signal that your level of quality, or you have high standards in the type of work you deliver. Alright, so this is what I said. This is a trick question for the purpose of a job interview, and I would encourage you, I would challenge you, if you want, to go throughout your story bank and to see if you could, where could you showcase even higher standards in the type of work that you do, in your subject matter expertise, to be clear. Okay, now, of course, again, a behavioral interview question answered in the STAR format, quantifiable results and whatnot. But the main idea I want to communicate here is high standards, right? Question number 5. Why do you want to work for Capital One? Okay, so what happens here is that most candidates would compliment and over-compliment their employers when answering these interview questions. Not to say that's a mistake, you wouldn't want to say bad things about them when asked or at any point during the job interview. But your job should be to differentiate yourself from other candidates. And if you put yourself in your interviewer's shoes and hear compliments over and over again, then you could imagine, that when you hear a candidate saying something different, in a good way, then that will pay off substantially when it comes to evaluating that candidate. What could be something interesting to say? Well, if you want to go on the extremes, well, I'm not sure I want to join you as of yet. I'm here to learn more about the opportunity and to see if the type of work, type of experience I have could be mutually beneficial. Okay, so you could say this as well if your CV allows, and if you feel that it makes sense to pitch it this way. But again, the point would be to differentiate yourself from other candidates, and this interview question, which is an easy interview question, could be something, could be a moment where you could score better than others. Okay, question number 6. Describe an instance where you use data or analytics to make a business decision, or to make a decision. It doesn't have to necessarily be business. So analytical skills, using data in your decision-making process, using data to cut through ambiguity. It's again a behavioral interview question, so you should structure in the STAR format. But long story short, how did data influence your decision-making process for the type of work that you do? If you're a software engineer, maybe some data, maybe you tuned up some algorithm. If you're an analyst, then I'm sure you'd have plenty of examples of working with data. If you're a director, maybe you delegated to find the right data, which in turn influenced a decision you had. Various types of scenarios. What I found at the moment, you know these questions in advance, you know more or less what to expect. You also know better how to prepare on these scenarios and eventually build a story bank, ideally, because this is the best way I found. This is the most efficient way that I found correlates consistently with interview success in high-performing companies, the story bank approach. Okay, and last but not least, question number 7, tell me about the time when you failed. Okay, so tell me about the time when you failed is the standard, the classic way an interviewer would understand if a candidate took their interview seriously. Because what happens if you're hearing this question for the first time, tell me about the time when you failed, chances are you're going to block. Okay, because people don't feel natural. You don't feel it natural to talk about failure. And during the heat of the moment, you can imagine, it's going to be exponentially harder, right? Now, the other scenario is when you try to come up with an example that was not an actual failure. You try to, a cover up. I never fail, I only learn. Or you give something that is not really impactful, right? And some people do get away with these examples, that they're trying not to put themselves in a delicate scenario. But the best possible interview answers to these tell me about time when you failed would be some actual failures with great learnings. Okay, and the key to giving great answers here would be the learnings part. And if you think about the STAR format, is the situation, task, and action that would present the actual failure, and then it's the learnings which would be on the results, right? And I'd even encourage you, the best answers, the best failure stories would focus half of the answer on the learnings. Okay, so if you brainstorm for something that had amazing learnings, that's when you optimize your chances of giving the most impactful answers during your job interview. So this was my top 7 list. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.